A young officer named Janusz was suddenly arrested by Soviet soldiers. He was accused of being a spy, even though the allegation was completely false. The accusation was merely a pretext fabricated by the Soviets to justify imprisoning him. When Janusz refused to sign the interrogation report, the military pressured his wife to give false testimony, claiming that her husband was indeed a spy. A few months later, Janusz was sent to a gulag prison camp deep in Siberia, an isolated and desolate place far removed from human civilization. Upon their arrival, the prisoners were warned by the camp commander that there were no concrete walls or electric fences. Yet anyone who tried to escape would surely die either from the brutal weather or from wild beasts roaming the wilderness. On his first night there, Janusz met a fellow inmate named Kabarov, who had also been imprisoned without a clear reason. The next day, the prisoners were forced to cut down trees in the freezing forest. From time to time, Janusz glanced toward the hilltops, wondering what lay beyond them. Deep inside, he began to question whether escaping from this place was truly impossible. That night, back in the barracks, Janusz and Kabarov continued their conversation. It was then that Kabarov revealed a secret. He had discovered a possible way to escape the gulag. Janusz was intrigued, but he hesitated. Even if they managed to get out, where could they go? The entire surrounding region was still under Soviet control. Kabarov explained that their only hope of survival was to cross into Mongolia, the nearest country, located roughly 1,000 kilometers away. Janusz eventually agreed to the plan. He even began considering bringing along a few trustworthy inmates to join their escape. Kabarov started gathering supplies for the plan through a system of barter among the prisoners. Time passed until one morning, as the inmates prepared to head into the forest for logging, a massive snowstorm suddenly struck. The freezing temperatures claimed the lives of many prisoners through hypothermia. Yet, instead of ordering them back to the barracks, the guards commanded everyone to lie down on the snow, a reckless decision that would only hasten their deaths. A prisoner named Smith boldly defied the order. He argued that the only way to survive was to head into the forest immediately and take shelter among the trees. At first, Smith was accused of insubordination and was nearly shot to death, but he stood his ground fearlessly. In his view, staying put would only be another path to certain death. Eventually, with no other choice, the guards followed Smith's advice. It was there that Janusz met Smith, along with several other prisoners who would later become his companions in the Great Escape. Although they survived the storm, the prisoners were punished even more harshly afterward. Smith and several others were transferred to the mining section, the most dangerous worksite in the entire camp. There, they were forced to exert every ounce of strength, while constantly facing the risk of cave-ins and inhaling toxic fumes day after day. One day, due to a lack of oxygen deep inside the mine, Janusz began to hallucinate and nearly lost consciousness. Fortunately, Smith came to his aid and revived him. In his weakened state, Janusz kept mumbling about his plan to escape. Smith tried to warn him, insisting that such a plan was hopeless and bound to fail. Even so, Smith eventually admitted that if Janusz ever did find a way out, he was willing to join him. As he put it, staying there was no different from waiting to die, whether from exhaustion or the poison in the mines. Sometime later, another blizzard struck the camp. Janusz saw it as a golden opportunity. He went to Kabarov and told him that they had to escape that very night. The storm, he reasoned, could conceal their tracks and make it harder for the guards to follow. Kabarov then introduced them to someone who knew a secret route out of the prison. After that, Janusz and his group began gathering supplies through the camp's barter system. Bit by bit, Kabarov managed to collect a bowl of bread and several other necessities. However, their escape plan was soon discovered by a brutal inmate named Falka, a man notorious for his violent temper and cruelty. Strangely, instead of reporting them to the guards, Falka insisted on joining the escape. His reason was simple. His life was in danger due to massive gambling debts owed to other prisoners. A few days later, their long-awaited moment arrived when the prison's generator broke down, plunging the camp into confusion. Amid the chaos, Janusz and his group seized the opportunity and set their daring plan into motion. The guards immediately unleashed their tracking dogs, but the raging snowstorm quickly erased all traces of the escapees. Running through the forest amid howling winds and freezing temperatures made it feel as if their lungs were turning to ice. The limited visibility caused by the blizzard made every step a perilous gamble. To survive, they crafted makeshift masks from tree bark to help them breathe and shield their faces from the biting snow. After walking nearly 30 kilometers, the group finally stopped to rest for a moment. Yet their journey was far from over the Mongolian border. Their ultimate destination was still about 1,000 kilometers away. Janusz then suggested that all their remaining supplies be gathered and divided equally. He reminded everyone that during this escape, selfishness was not an option. Unity was the only way they could survive. Everyone agreed, especially since Janusz was the only one with real navigation and wilderness survival skills, thanks to his military experience operating in forested regions. Impressed by Janusz's intelligence and determination, Falka began to admire him. He even volunteered to act as Janusz's personal protector, realizing that without him, the group would likely get lost in the vast wilderness. But their supplies were painfully limited enough to last only a week. After that, they would have to rely entirely on whatever nature could offer. One day, while they were out gathering dry wood, one of the members, Kazakh, suddenly went missing. His vision had grown blurry from malnutrition and the dim light of the forest, causing him to lose his sense of direction. Janusz and the others split up to search for him, but the darkness of night and the dense forest made the search nearly impossible. Meanwhile, the disoriented Kazakh began to hallucinate, imagining that someone was guiding him back toward the campfire, which, in reality, was not far from where he stood. Exhausted and freezing, Kazakh sat down to rest, unaware that the spot would become his final resting place.
Take this innocent soul into thy keeping.
3 men died here today.
Weeks passed. After 2 relentless weeks of trekking, Janusz's group finally emerged from the Siberian snow forests, but their food supply was nearly gone. The next morning, they came across a wolf feasting on a deer carcass. Driven by unbearable hunger, Janusz and his companions desperately decided to take the deer carcass from the wolves. They shouted and swung wooden sticks to scare the beasts away. Once they succeeded, they immediately devoured the meat without hesitation, caring little about whether it was dirty or already bitten by the wolves. The next day, Janusz made a momentous decision. He bid farewell to the group, telling them that he would go alone to search for Lake Baikal. The others were too weak to continue, and as their leader, Janusz chose to risk his own life in hopes of finding a water source that could save them all. He promised that if he succeeded in finding the lake, he would return and lead them there. The journey took him 3 grueling days. After enduring extreme weather and trudging through deadly snow-covered forests, Janusz finally reached Lake Baikal, but his struggle wasn't over. He still had to travel another 3 days to return to his waiting companions. When Janusz finally made it back, his body was frail and his face was covered in cuts from the blizzard, but his spirit remained unbroken. Seeing his determination and courage, Smith could only stare in awe. To him, Janusz was no longer just a fellow prisoner, he was a true leader, the reason they were still alive. A few days later, as the group neared the area around the lake, they noticed someone following them from a distance. To their surprise, it turned out to be a young woman. She claimed to be Polish, just like Janusz and some of the others. The woman explained that she too had escaped from Soviet soldiers and had been surviving alone in the wilderness for days. Janusz, compassionate by nature, wanted to let her join them so she wouldn't die alone in the wild. But Smith and Falka strongly objected, fearing that her presence would only become a burden to their already struggling group. Even after being turned away, the woman continued to follow them secretly from afar. Then one day, Janusz's group came across a deer trapped in a mud pit, a rare stroke of luck. Without having to hunt, they finally enjoyed a full meal of fresh meat that night. Because of the abundance of food, one of the members felt pity for the woman who had been tailing them and suggested they finally invite her to join. The next morning, after camping near Lake Baikal, Janusz and the group took the opportunity to clean themselves up bathing, washing their clothes, and shaving the thick beards that had grown over the long, grueling journey. Since being allowed to eat with the group, the woman they had met earlier, Irina, quickly grew close to everyone. With her gentle demeanor and warm smile, she easily won their hearts. In fact, there was a small village near Lake Baikal. In theory, they could have pretended to be wanderers and asked for food, but Janusz believed that doing so was far too risky. If their disguise was discovered, the entire group could be captured. Therefore, he decided that no one was to approach the village. However, Falka disagreed with that decision. Stubborn as ever, he secretly snuck into the village to steal food. When Janusz and the others found out, they were terrified if Falka were caught. The villagers would surely hunt them all down. Not long after, Falka returned with his clothes covered in blood. Everyone immediately feared the worst, thinking he had killed someone. But the blood, it turned out, came from a guard dog he had slain while stealing. Reckless as his actions were, that night the group finally ate their fill, thanks to what Falka had brought back. During that meal, Irina suddenly began to share her story. She revealed that her parents were Polish, who had moved to the Soviet Union to join the communist movement. But along the way, they were accused of being spies and eventually arrested. Irina, who was only 10 at the time, was sent along with her younger brother to a state orphanage, where they were treated like animals. Her brother died there, and since then, Irina had been on the run seeking nothing but freedom. Weeks passed, and after their long and exhausting journey, the group finally reached the border. There were guards everywhere, especially during the daytime, so they decided to wait until nightfall before attempting to cross. After coming such a long way, Falka made a surprising decision. He chose to stay behind in Soviet territory. As it turned out, his reason for escaping prison had never been about seeking freedom, but rather about escaping his gambling debts. For Falka, this entire escape was merely a way to move to another prison, not a pursuit of liberty. Yet, despite his controversial nature, he kept his promise. He had protected Janusz all the way to the border.
Goodbye, Janusz.
After parting ways with Falka, Janusz and the remaining members continued their journey, hoping to reach the people of Mongolia and start a new life there. But along the way, they came across a hut bearing the emblem of the Communist Party. The symbol confirmed their worst fear. Mongolia had allied itself with the Soviet Union, making it no longer a safe haven. The only nearby option was China, but at that time, the region was still occupied by Japanese forces. Trapped in a desperate situation, Janusz came up with a seemingly insane idea. What if they crossed into India instead? The problem was that the journey would span 3,500 kilometers, and they would have to traverse the Himalayan mountains. A few days later, Janusz's group encountered a band of local villagers. Smith panicked, fearing they might be captured, but Janusz managed to calm him down. They pretended to be lost wanderers. Fortunately, the villagers didn't suspect anything. In fact, they offered them a small amount of drinking water. However, they also warned the group that ahead lay a vast desert with no shelter whatsoever. Throughout their trek, the only edible creatures they could find were lizards, and their water supply was dangerously scarce. If they didn't find a river soon, they would die of dehydration. But after days of walking, all they found were mirages shimmering in the distance. Just as they were about to give up, they heard birds chirping somewhere far ahead. Janusz immediately recognized it as a sign of nearby water. Following the sound, they discovered an old well. Relief washed over them. Everyone shouted in joy and drank as much as they could. Some of the group suggested staying near the well until help arrived, but Janusz refused. He knew that if they rested too long, their bodies would weaken and their chances of survival would drop sharply. So the next day, they filled every container with water, even soaking their clothes and bodies to protect themselves from the searing desert heat. But their preparations didn't last long. Not long after leaving the well, a massive sandstorm struck. Their water supply dwindled rapidly, food ran out, and their bodies grew weaker by the hour. In that condition, Irina was the most vulnerable. At first, they thought she had merely fainted from exhaustion, but soon they realized her legs were swelling badly from sunstroke. She tried to hide her pain, but by the next morning, she died quietly in her companion's arms.
And to take her to heaven.
Irina's death shattered Smith, but there was no time to grieve. They had to keep moving. Their feet were bleeding and blistered, and before long, Thomas, the group's cook, became the next to fall, collapsing lifelessly in the middle of the vast desert. Even when hope was almost gone, Janusz kept leading the group forward, until finally, they saw the edge of the desert. But by then, Smith was barely conscious. He begged Janusz to leave him behind, saying he was too old to continue. Yet Janusz refused, carrying him out of the desert with the last of his strength. The next morning, their condition was so dire they could hardly stand. That was when a snake appeared, and Janusz realized, where there's an animal, there must be water. They followed the snake and eventually found a small spring. After drinking until they were satisfied, they hunted the snake for food. Poison was the least of their worries now. That night, Smith once again begged Janusz to leave him, believing he had become nothing but a burden. But Janusz refused. He finally revealed the true reason he fought so hard to survive, to return to his wife in Poland. Though she had once betrayed him, he believed she had done it under duress. He told Smith this story to remind him that everyone needs a reason to keep living. Janusz's words reignited Smith's will to survive. Though the road ahead was still long, they knew they had overcome the hardest part. Sometime later, they reached the border of Tibet, where the local villagers welcomed them with kindness. From there, India was only a step away. However, due to the harsh winter, the village elders advised them to wait until spring before continuing. Smith, who turned out to be an American, decided not to go any further. There was a US military outpost nearby, and he chose to stay. It was a quiet but emotional farewell. Janusz, however, was determined to continue. Defying the snowstorms, he pressed on toward his final goal. Though he first set out alone, 2 of his companions eventually followed and joined him. After enduring a grueling trek through the Himalayas, they finally crossed into India. Janusz's arrival was met with tears and celebration from the locals. While the film cannot capture every moment of this extraordinary journey, history records that for decades afterward, Janusz was unable to return to Poland, his homeland still trapped under communist rule. It wasn't until 1989, when the revolution broke out and communism finally fell, that Janusz could go home at last, to fulfill his final promise, to reunite with his wife, who had waited for him all those years.